So just to get into a bit more detail about what we're expecting from your log frame in Ocean, your log frame should have one project outcome statement, and this outcome statement should have 2 to 5 indicators. And we ask you to make sure that those indicators cover both the marine environment impact and the poverty reduction um, aspects of that outcome. So, and each of your indicators should have sources of evidence attached to them. So the means of verification are those sources of evidence. And each of your indicators should have some baselines, milestones, and targets. So here's an example of what it could look like. So you have the outcome statement, and then you have one marine environment indicator and 2 poverty reduction related indicators. And each indicator has its specific baseline, milestones, and targets. So your baseline is where you are before any of the project interventions have gone ahead. The milestones are some targets on an annual basis, and your target is your end of project target. So in some cases, it might not make sense to have milestones, so you don't need to include it for those types of indicators. But for all of your indicators, you need to provide some means of verification that are related to that indicator so that it's possible to see whether the indicator has progressed or not. At output level, you can have 3 to 5 outputs with 2 to 5 indicators each. Projects can typically have 3 to 4 outputs, and that would be manageable. We don't recommend putting too many outputs because it increases your reporting burden. So remember that outputs are the specific and direct deliverables produced from undertaking your project activities. You should be measuring the indicators should measure the progress towards those outputs. And again, you need the means of verification and baselines, milestones, and targets. And that's what it could look like here. So you have your output is communities have improved knowledge of marine conservation and fishing practices. And your indicators are that fisherfolk in the community are trained in sustainable fishing and processing practices, and new marine conservation curriculum materials are taught in schools in the 3 communities. And then you've got the baselines and targets attached to that. So, and the evidence that they're using, the means of verification, could be training attendance records and teacher feedback forms on the new curriculum. Just a little bit more about indicators. So the indicators are variables that can tell us if the change that we're interested in is happening or not. They can be quantitative or qualitative. So that could be reported as numbers or reported as kind of qualitative statements. And they're a critical element of your monitoring plan. So they'll help you to know whether or not you're on track, and they'll help to demonstrate that progress towards your project outcome and outputs. And ideally, your indicators can be independently verifiable and linked not just to your activities, but to the results themselves. And the best kinds of indicators are SMART, so they're specific, they're measurable, they're achievable, they're relevant, and they're time-bound. So try to make these indicators realistic. If you go too ambitious, it might be too difficult to measure. But also make sure that they are ambitious enough to attract the funding and attention of the expert committee. And for baselines, milestones, and targets, this is a really good way to make the targets specific and time-bound, so the S and T of SMART. So as I mentioned before, the baseline is that measure of the condition of that indicator before the activity has started, so that you can compare by the end of the project. And the target is what you're looking to achieve by the end of the project. A milestone can be set annually. We appreciate you might not have baseline data at this stage, so just indicate when you would plan to collect that in your project. It's recommended that you would be doing that very early on, depending on the length of your projects. That could be in the first 3 to 6 months. and think about where you're going to collect it from. Is that going to be secondary data, or are you going to collect that information yourself? And the means of verification. So that's that evidence that you've achieved the indicator. Just think about the data sources here. Consider whether primary data or secondary data is going to be used. Is it available for somewhere else? So you don't need to budget for that. Is that data going to be reliable and objective enough for your needs? And if you need to collect data, who's going to do it? How much is it going to cost? And think about integrating that into your budget. And most of all, you need to make sure that that data is going to show that your outputs and your outcome have been met. So just remember that the means of verification and the indicators need to be linked. So we sometimes see applications where it seems to be a completely irrelevant data source next to the indicator. So make sure that what you're putting actually can help you measure that indicator, and try to be independent and objective. And make sure that they're actually relevant to the output and outcome. So the indicators is no it's really important that your indicators actually help to measure that output or outcome, and aren't unrelated. Well, they'll need to show that your outputs and outcome have been met. So I'll pause here just to give an example and hear from you based on what you now know about smart indicators, how we can do some improvements. So we've got this outcome statement: increase public awareness of the importance of improved marine protected area management to fisheries and the potential benefits of alternative livelihoods. And then it's got a couple of indicators. There's a number of conferences and workshops, increased media coverage, changes in attitude. And then for the means of verification, it's project reports, outcome, evaluation surveys conducted in the final year of the project. So I want to give you a minute to think there, and I want to hear your feedback on this outcome statement, the indicators and means for verification. So some things you might want to feed in are, is that going to be capable of measuring progress? Any thoughts in the chat? How can we improve on this? Anybody consider these indicators as specific, measurable, achievable, relevant? We've got a no. Charlotte's mentioning that we need to be more specific, and you could add numbers that you want to aim towards. Yep, that would really help with being specific. Yeah, and adding the time boundedness would be helpful. Yeah, what is the expected change in attitude? Be more specific. Maybe the project report is useful, but not necessarily the strongest means of verification. Yeah, it's not really clear whether that's going to be objective as a source of evidence here. Sarah points out that you need a baseline for attitude changes. So that's correct. You've got the means for verification. It says they're going to have an evaluation survey in the final year of the project, but you need something to compare that against. So you probably need a baseline survey to understand where people have started in their attitudes. And Laura says changes in attitudes is very ambiguous and vague. So exactly that. It's very difficult to measure that. So you would need to either specify that a bit better in your indicators themselves, or really explain how you're going to do that in your methodology. Like, what is your approach going to be there? And the indicator could be attendance at workshops rather than number of workshops. So that's a really useful point, Leslie. So the number of conferences and workshops organized is basically just an activity, isn't it? So it's not really telling you how well you're progressing towards your outcome. It's better to have that more you understanding the quality of those workshops and whether they've been well attended or people found them useful. And Maria mentions you could provide a more detailed method of for verification. Yes, you could, and be more specific about where you're going to get that data and because it could be a particular section in a project report. So that's really helpful. Thanks, everybody. We'll move on, but if you have any further thoughts, feel free to pop it in the chat. So just to come back to JEDC, the log frame is really a key area where you can show how your proposal meets the JEDC empowering standard. So have a look in the MEL guidance, and there's some tips there, but to help get your log frame to be JEDC empowering, think about creating indicators that are planning to report disaggregated data to track your impacts of activities related to women and other marginalized groups. And you could also consider including a JEDC-focused outcome indicator and output indicator. And then other ways to incorporate the gender equality, disability, and social inclusion into your project MEL is to make sure that you're planning for collecting disaggregated data. You're setting inclusive indicators. You're planning to monitor participation and access to things like your events and your workshops or your training. And think about how you're going to evaluate your outcomes for different groups, or how you're going to make sure the things that you learn from the project are inclusive. How will you make that available in different languages or for different literacy levels, for example? And I think one of the most important points is to engage a diverse range of stakeholders when you're doing your project design in MEL. Find out what people want to see from the project, understand what their needs are, and understand what kind of barriers they've faced when trying to engage in the kinds of activities that you are planning.